You're listening to the Rise Above podcast, the only podcast on the planet with a mission to help you live a free and uncommon life. Here's your host, Greg Smith.
Yes. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining me today. I am so glad that you're here. This is the Rise Above podcast, and you're listening to episode number 19. I'm your host, Greg Smith, and I believe that if you desire uncommon freedom in business and in life, it starts with creating a champion's mindset from within. Well, it's been a long minute since my last episode, and for that, I apologize. I had started this podcast last year, in the springtime, and I was really excited about it. I'm still really excited about it. Life is just absolutely crazy, and today I'm going to tell you a story about my day in court, actually 2 days in court. But before we get to that, I'll fill you in a little bit. Over the past, months or so, I have a couple other businesses. And so the podcast for me, when I originally started podcast, was something of a passion project. And I started because I really just wanted to share life experiences, dealing with literally hundreds and thousands of people with leadership and development and mentoring and coaching over the years. I wanted to be able to share that information and be able to get it out to the world. And that's exactly what I'm doing. And so my producer, Jonathan, and I are working on a project right now that I'm really excited to share with you guys here in the coming future. And I also have a couple other things that are up my sleeve if you're on my email list. And if you're not on my email list, you should be. It's riseabovepodcast.com. You can go there and, right now it has you opt in for a sneak peek episode, which obviously was my very first episode. And there's a lesson within that. My first episode talks about I'm a procrastinator. If you haven't listened to that, that's one of the most listened to. Actually, it is the number one episode that I have. It's been downloaded almost 1,000 times. And we actually, at Rise Above Podcast, so I have hit over 10,000 downloads with only 18 episodes. So that is really stinking cool. And it's super awesome because I still get feedback. There's still people that I meet, you specifically, many of you, I'll see and you're asking, when's the next episode? Or you tell me, I had one gal at a conference I was at just in February where she was like, this one specific episode changed my life. And I was like, it changed your life. That's a little extreme. And sure enough, I was like, well, what was it about that? Because I love getting feedback. I love knowing, kind of what people are learning and what they think of the podcast, good, bad, or indifferent. And so I actually read every single rating and review, just FYI. So it was super cool. So anyways, it's been pretty cool what's happened over the past year. And so I'm really excited to crank this back up and get some messages out to you. So let's get into the meat of today. And by the way, as I move forward, what I was going to say, my house I have 3 kids. Right now they're 6, 3, and 1. So whenever you're listening to this is 2019, 6, 3, and 1. And recently we found out that we have a 4th child on the way. And my home office, I became an entrepreneur, so I'd have the ability to work from home. And I love working from home. However, it's created a lot of challenges with the podcast specifically over the past year, because when I first started the podcast, I was still night owling, okay? And so I've always been a night owl, like literally my entire life. I used to stay up in my parents' bedroom. It was the only room in the house that had a TV upstairs. My bedroom didn't have a TV. My sister's bedroom didn't have a TV, but my parents did. And so I literally slept on their floor longer than I'd like to admit as a child. But I slept in there because I wanted to watch Nick at Night. And so I just watched Nick at Night every single night. And I'd be up until like 1 or 2 o'clock every night as a 5-year-old, 6-year-old, 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old, and even into high school. I was always up extremely late. And so over the past year, this has been the first year for Samuel to be in kindergarten. And so he's in kindergarten. And so 5 days out of the week, we are heading to kindergarten in the morning, whereas before I didn't have that. And so my schedule has had to essentially change completely. And it made it more difficult as the fall time happened, which is when the show kind of, I started being less consistent with the show. It became extremely more difficult because I didn't want to stay up as late. And that's the only time when my house is perfectly quiet. And even when the kids are out, which they are right now with Stephanie, with the home office, the other thing that I dealt with was my German Shepherd, Pearl. And so she actually passed last month. And so, gosh, man, I love her. But, she would bark, if the mailman came or anything like that. And so I was always a perfectionist, and this will kill productivity, by the way. Being a perfectionist where you want the perfect audio, the perfect room, and you want the audio to be clear. And in reality, I don't think you really care if my audio is perfect. What you really care about is, as long as it's not annoying, and there's not this background wind in your ear, what you really care about is the content. What you care about is the meat and the value. And so I'm going to make it a point to just start sharing more frequently. You may get a little background noise. I may be in my car in the future. Fortunately, right now, with Pearl passing and the kids are out, I can have a very quiet house for this first episode kind of back. And so I'm excited for that. So a little background of kind of like what's been shaken out. But to get into my day in court, man, so, not too long ago, I got a letter in the mail. And it was the letter that, everybody kind of dreads. And it was the letter that I got called for jury duty. So that's probably not what you thought. But this is really fascinating. And I think there's some nuggets in here. I learned a lot through this process. So I was essentially called upon to be a juror. And I filled out this, essentially this application to be a juror. It's very thorough. They ask you, how many kids you have and things of that nature. They ask you if you're a handgun permit owner, or do you actually, I think they ask if you own any guns at all. And they ask all these different questions. And so what they do is they give you 4 days over the next 3 weeks that you have to call a number and you have to see if you have jury duty the next day. And so the very first day that I call in, I don't have it. So I'm like, whoo, dodged a bullet. Cool. Although at the same time, I was kind of excited to go in because having the ability as an entrepreneur, I wasn't really like stressed about work or taking the day off. I was kind of really curious. My cousin is a bailiff. I have friends that are attorneys, and so I'm kind of texting them, asking them what I should expect. And many of them said, hey, don't get your hopes up. You're probably not going to end up in court whatsoever. Usually these things plead out. And so the second day that I call in, sure enough, I have to show up. And so I show up at the courthouse, and there's about 24 jurors there. And inside this tiny room, by the way, this tiny room that's sandwiched in between two courtrooms. So we're all there. It's extremely quiet. There's a TV on with some news in the morning, but we're all sitting, and these chairs are like the smallest chairs. Like when you're sitting next to somebody, no matter what their size is, like you're sitting next to them, you're like touching shoulders on both sides. That's how it was. There are these red little chairs, and you kind of walk in, and it's really weird. It's like the first day of school, you're like eyeballing everybody, and everybody's kind of looking at you, and you're like, man, did I dress appropriate for court today? And what am I to expect? And oh, there's a TV on, and oh, there's only one restroom for everybody. And there was like no fan in there, it was like, extremely uncomfortable, seeing one person go, and then one person would be in there for like 7 minutes. You're like, well, okay. So, they obviously didn't get up early enough to get themselves moving. And so anyways, we're sitting in this little room, and this guy comes in. He essentially tells us what we can expect. And I'll share that here in a second. But this particular day, we sat around for about it was about an hour and 15 minutes altogether. And sure enough, the two cases for that day both pled out. And we got to go home. Yay. So, we sat in this room awkwardly. And me, I try to strike up conversation with you. And I had a couple people that wanted to talk, a couple people who didn't find my jokes very humorous. And so the next time, the third time, I call in, And now this was like a week and a half away. They kind of give you a week off in between this. And so you have like a Tuesday, Thursday of week 1. Week 2 is off, and then Tuesday, Thursday of the following week. And so sure enough, I call in, boom, you got to go to court. And I'm like, cool, man, I know what to expect now. Like now I'm pumped. And it's not because I'm like, it's because I literally I took it serious. Like I read the juror handbook. I was asking people like what to expect because you literally have somebody's fate in your hands as a juror. And I think this is I really do think this is a civic duty, to take it so serious because you're truly deciding if somebody's guilty or not guilty, or you're deciding, in a civil case, essentially, if somebody should be awarded something or not. And by the way, the jury decides what that award is, if you're essentially what the settlement would be. It's really interesting. But in a criminal case, you don't. The judge determines what the judgment is and what the punishment would be. And so, long story short, we get there, same thing, super awkward, and we get called into the courtroom. And so now it's like it's on, as we're walking into the courtroom. Now, this is a small town courtroom too, by the way. So as you're walking into the courthouse, you're next to all the jurors, you're next to family members, you're next to the defendants and the plaintiffs, like everybody's there. It's really awkward. And you kind of know who's who by the way that they're dressed, because the defendant is wearing a tie and a full suit. Like you kind of know, like, yeah, he's trying to clean up his image, and you can see it all. Like, and then you can see the family members in the particular case where I'm from. They're wearing like camo pajamas, and then you got all the jurors are kind of coming in at the same time, and so we get called into the courtroom, and there's 24, 25 of us. Okay, and we're sitting there. And the judge explains to us kind of how this is going to go. Now, the bailiff had already explained to us like what to expect, but now the judge reiterates it. And the judge lets us know that he's going to ask us everybody, 18 questions. And we have to answer audibly, so out loud. And they're recording the whole thing. And so he asks us questions and things very simple, but basically he's pre-qualifying and making sure that nobody knows the defendant or the plaintiff or works where they work or knows either of the attorneys, that they haven't read about the case prior, because this is a criminal case. So, they're making sure that, everybody's going to be unbiased essentially coming into it. And so then he asks little questions like, hey, is English your number one language? And if not, which the lady in front of me was French, he asked her a few more questions. How long have you been speaking English, et cetera? And it was 17 years for her. So she's good. She's in. And so everybody gets pre-qualified. So everybody's in. And the whole time that this is happening, you have the jury sitting here kind of in a classroom. Like literally you're behind, if you've ever, looked at a courtroom on TV or watched this stuff, you're behind the attorneys. And then you got the judge sitting up there. And so the whole time, both attorneys are there and the defendant's there as well. And this guy, so the guy is sitting there, the defendant, just with this like zombie look, like, it almost looked like he was drugged out for the day, because he just like showed no emotion the whole time. He never once looked at anybody in the jury. I don't know what he was staring at, but this went on for like 90 minutes throughout this whole process I'm going to tell you about here within the next 10 minutes or so.
Are you someone who wants to live life on your own terms? Do you dream of having more time to spend doing the things you love? Then download your copy of The Freedom Formula absolutely free at www.riseabovepodcast.com. What are you waiting for? Go to www.riseabovepodcast.com to get your free copy of The Freedom Formula.
And so he's there. And of course, you're kind of looking, you're kind of like, I wonder, is he guilty? Is he not guilty? You don't know, right? And you can't make a decision based upon the way that he looks. But as humans, we tend to start the judging process based upon somebody's looks or mannerisms. And that's what I'm going to talk about here, because it was really interesting what happened. And so the judge lets us know that this is going to be a harassment case. And it's essentially a he said, she said case, him versus her. And that's it. There's only two people that are going to be in court. You got the lady and you got the guy. And so what happens now that everybody's pre-qualified, the judge picks a random 8 people, picks 4 women and 4 men, and they go into the jury box. Well, I'm not in that group. However, we are required, the other 16 of us, we're required to sit there and listen to what happens next. And here's what happens, because there's an alternate, there's a number 9 that gets thrown in. But there's also the ability to recuse certain jurors based upon what the attorneys think or don't think of that person. And so they start asking questions to these people. And what it gets down to is the defendant's attorney starts asking about the Me Too movement, the social media Me Too movement, the whole thing with Judge Kavanaugh. I didn't really follow it, truth be told. And they're asking these people their opinion of, hey, what was your opinion of the Me Too movement? And it's really interesting. I don't have time to get into this, but the psychology of these people, they were so impressionable. Humans, in general. This is the machine, this is the matrix, like in live action here. These people were so impressionable that they started to qualify themselves as yes. And they essentially started answering the way that the attorneys wanted them to answer. I mean, legitimately, there's no way all 8 people thought the same exact thing. But one person would say something and then the other person would kind of reiterate, yeah, I feel that way too. And, it's on and on. And so what ultimately happened is 2 people get recused. So they ask those people questions. We're all there. Well, boom, it's Greg's turn. Greg gets called up to replace one of the people that got recused. Now, as we're there, now, mind you, like I'm nervous. I'm walking, get up from kind of like the pew, right? And I walk across the courtroom floor, and everybody's looking at you, and the 6 jurors that are there, like, they're looking at you and you're kind of looking at them. You're looking at the judge and you're walking past the attorneys, both attorneys and the defendant, and then you take your seat. And it was almost like I was on trial. I'm like sitting there with my heart pumping and, I'm like, oh my goodness, like, okay, he's going to ask me now. And so now it's my turn, and the lady who got replaced, her as well, they go in, now they have to ask us the same questions, essentially. Now, I had already heard the questions. I had already seen how these attorneys were starting to manipulate the jurors into their way of thinking, right? That's their job, is to persuade you into their way of thinking. Now, this is happening in the outside world all the time. Things are coming at you. People are coming at you. Marketing messages are coming at you to make you think and persuade you to think in a certain way. And it's up to you to depend on or to decide on how impressionable you're going to be. How impressionable are you going to be? Well, I just watched 6 people be some of the most impressionable people I've ever seen in my life. Like, I felt like, I could hypnotize those people to do anything I wanted, because I was watching this attorney essentially do this to them, both attorneys, mind you. And so I get up there and he's asking the lady in front of me these questions like, how do you feel about the Me Too movement? And the overall theme was that these people were saying, well, that was a smear campaign. Although it got overruled, by the way, that he couldn't talk about Judge Kavanaugh, he could only talk about generalities. And so these people were saying, oh, that was a smear campaign, yada, yada, yada. And so then he would come down and he's like, well, how do you decide if somebody's guilty or not? This is the good stuff. He's like, how do you decide if somebody's guilty or not? Now, mind you, the judge told us that we can only convict somebody of being guilty if there was, it was beyond a reasonable doubt, okay? Beyond a reasonable doubt, right? Now, this is very important because beyond a reasonable doubt, and I looked this up, you literally, the highest burden of proof is beyond a reasonable doubt. And it's a clear and convincing evidence. Clear and convincing evidence. And they were asking this lady, like, well, how do you make a decision? This and that. And he's like, well, you have kids, and she's like, well, my kid's 18 months old. He's like, okay, moving on. So he comes to me, asked me the same thing about the Me Too movement. I said, well, honestly, I didn't say honestly. I try not to say that honestly, because when you say honestly, it makes you think that you're not truthful every other time that you don't say honestly. So anyways, caught myself with my own idiocracy there. So I didn't say that really, but what I did say is I said, here's the deal. I said, I don't pay attention to the news. I gave the news up years ago. And I said, I'm really not a big social media guy. I said, so I didn't really pay a whole lot of attention to it. And he said, well, but how do you feel about it? How do you feel? He's like, how do you like, essentially, he was asking me, is he guilty or not guilty? And I said, hey, listen, I said, at the end of the day, what you're asking me about is the situation that's online in between all these different people, all these men and all these women. So you're asking me to make a judgment based upon circumstances and situations that I have absolutely no information about. The only thing I have is, what one person is saying versus what the other person is saying. I said, and frankly, it's not my place to judge. That's why I was like, and frankly, it's not my place to judge. I got all pious on him, but it's the truth. It's not my place to judge. And he was asking me to judge and make decisions based upon these things, right? The social media campaign of Me Too. Now, were some of these people harassed? Absolutely. I guarantee they were. Were some of them just coming out of the woodwork to maybe shame or tarnish some people's reputations? Absolutely. I think that too. I think it was both sides. I think that's just human nature, is you have both things going on. But how do I know who's telling the truth and who's not? I don't. Okay. And so then he didn't like that answer. So then he gets into, he's like, well, you have kids. And I'm like, sure do. 6, 3, and 1. He's like, well, how do you know if there is no evidence, which one is telling the truth? I'm like, first off, we need clear and convincing evidence, right? Okay. So I'm like, hello, like the court case is clear and convincing evidence. Is what the judge just told us. But he's like, how do you know? And I said, well, frankly, if it's my child, I said, my child is my DNA, and I've known my child for 6 years. I've known my other one for 3. I said, I pretty well know when they're telling the truth or not because it's my kid. I said, and frankly, I know who is normally the accuser, and I normally know what their motives are. I know if Charlotte is trying to get Sam in trouble. I know if Sam is trying to get Char in trouble. My kids typically don't do that, to be frank, but I would know it. I mean, I know my situation with my sister back when I was growing up, and how, you may try to tattletale and get her in trouble and take the blame off you, et cetera, et cetera. And so what I told him is, I said, my kids are different. I said, you're asking me, how do I know if somebody's guilty? What he wanted me to say, because I watched other jurors say this, was essentially, by the way that somebody looks, if they look down, if they look nervous, because the other attorney was trying to make a case that, hey, you may have somebody that's on the stand, and would you agree that maybe their nervousness or sweating could simply be because they're on the stand and not necessarily because they're lying? Of course. But the other guy was making a case that that's how you make a decision, is based upon how they act. Now, somebody may act as shady as all get out, okay? And they may be super guilty. But at the end of the day, so I tell this guy, this attorney, I said, well, listen, I said, you're asking me about my kids, right? And he says, yeah. I said, well, at the end of the day, I think this has no bearing on what my job today as a juror is, which is make a decision on the factual evidence that is put forth in front of me from both sides, because you're asking me to give you information and make a decision about what may or may not happen over the course of today based upon 2 people who I have no experience with or know nothing about. And they didn't like that answer. So I got kicked off. Got kicked off for the day and got recused. They don't like people who can think for themselves. They don't like people who can think for themselves and people that are not super impressionable. And so the reason I wanted to share that was 2 things. One, I have truly adopted, the older I get, because here's the deal. In this particular case, he was going to say one thing, she was going to say one thing. Could he have been guilty? Yes. Could he have been innocent? Yes. Do we actually know? No, we don't. And that was before the case even started. We knew as jurors, they had no factual evidence. They said we have a picture of the room and it's he said, she, they literally in court said it's he said, she said. Well, if it's he said, she said, and our job is only to convict somebody as guilty if we have the burden of proof of beyond a reasonable doubt, which is clear and convincing evidence, then how can you rightfully, because you're dealing with somebody's liberty, You're dealing with somebody's liberty and their freedom. And I take freedom very serious. You know that. I've talked to you about this. And so how can you convince somebody, although you may think they're so guilty, you may think they're guilty, and they might be, but you don't know beyond a reasonable doubt unless there's clear and convincing evidence. So in your day-to-day life, what I want to tell you is that you can't judge. First off, even if there is clear and convincing evidence, you can make a decision based upon, how you feel, but still not your place to judge the person. Okay? Now, in this case, it was because you're the jury. But in life, I don't judge people based upon the experience. I think I talked about this in a prior episode. Based upon the experience that somebody else had with them. I may be a little bit more on guard, but I can only make a decision based upon clear and factual evidence or my experience with that person. Boom, period. Okay? So, don't judge that which is not your job to judge. The only time it's really your job to judge anything is when you're a juror. Other than that, it's not really your place to judge. Don't judge people. And at the same time, my other lesson was that be acutely aware of the impressionability that you have or don't have. What we need in the world today are free thinkers. We need free thinkers. And you, my friend, you are a free thinker because you're listening to something like this. If you've made it 20 some odd minutes into this, you are a free thinker. And that's awesome. That's why I love you. That's why I do this podcast. And that's why I'm excited about the content to put out, is because I want to be surrounded by free thinkers. And so don't allow others to have so much control over you, so much mind space over you, that they can make you not think clear and concise. All right? So that was really it. Longer episode than I normally go. First one back in a long time. I hope you enjoyed my story of my day in court. It was a very interesting trip, and if you ever get picked for jury duty, take it serious. It's a serious thing. All right, read the juror handbook. Understand what your job is. You would. I hope that you would want somebody to take it just as serious if you ever ended up in court for any reason. And the fact is, you may say, "I'm never going to end up in court." Well, you just never know. There is weird things like making murder. Who knows if he's guilty or not? We don't really know. But you could end up in court for something you never did. And I hope that the jurors there can think clearly and freely, they're not impressionable, and that they only judge based upon clear and convincing evidence. All right? And so if you have not rated or given me a review, maybe this is the first episode you're ever listening to, please hop on over to iTunes and do that for me. I would so appreciate it. It'd be awesome. I love reading those. And if you're not on the email list, so you can see some of the cool stuff that's getting ready to come out outside of that you will not hear about on the podcast, make sure you go to riseabovepodcast.com and opt in for my email newsletter. I am somebody who obviously does not hit you up all the time. I will only communicate things that will help you grow and develop as a person, as a business person, as a regular person, as a husband, etc., etc. So with that, until next time, take care. God bless. Greg's out.
This is thepodcastfactory.com.